I'm Scott Lucas, and this is World Unfiltered. Thank you for joining us today as we examine, well, let me start with a statement about what we're examining from Turkey's President Erdogan. Last month, in late December, President Erdogan made an announcement that raised headlines around the world, in Turkey, in Israel, and in watching countries. Only days after Israel had begun striking what are called the Abrahamic Accords for better relations, indeed normalization of relations with countries such as the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, Erdogan said at a press conference that he was also hoping for better relations with Israel after a period during his prime ministership, his presidency, which had been far from stable in the contacts between the two countries on military, economic, and political fronts. Now, he did mention that, quote, we have some difficulties with the people at the top. Make of that what you will with the longtime Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu. But he also referred to the fact that below problems at the top and below the Palestine issue, which he said was still important to Turkey, our relations with Israel and intelligence have not ceased anymore. They are still continuing. So is President Erdogan indicating that he's looking for better relations with Israel? And better relations means what? Does it actually mean better relations between those agencies, the intelligence and military agencies to which he was alluding? And what does that mean not only on direct relations between the countries, but on areas where the countries are involved, from the Middle East to North Africa to the Eastern Mediterranean? Well, I thought I would ask the questions to someone who knows. Selin Nasi is a longtime freelance journalist and an international relations specialist. Congratulations on your PhD last year, Selin, which is on Turkish-Israeli relations. She has also published an article with Professor Soliozo, who we just interviewed for World Unfiltered, about Turkey and its view on the world. That article was on Turkey and Israel and the Syrian crisis. So consider this a sequel that will take our discussion even higher to what we discussed then. Selin, thank you so much for joining us on World Unfiltered.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm very much humbled with your introduction. Thank you. Where shall we start? I think bilateral relations seem to be on a positive trajectory, given President Erdogan's latest statements. And when I look at the negotiation process, as much as I'm reading from the press, both sides are trying to make clear about they're trying to make clear that they intend to improve relations, but they're also testing waters and trying to explore the points that each side is eager to compromise, perhaps. So I think we are moving towards a positive ending, but we don't know how it's gonna play out. But at least we know that it is possible, reconciliation is possible. Yet there are also obstacles, and I'm sure we will discuss in a detailed way today in our podcast. Shall I go back to the background of how shall we proceed?
I was going to ask you to help me out here, because here are these two very important countries in terms of the positions that they hold geographically, but also their political significance. Have relations been up and down, verging between conflict and cooperation for decades, ever since Israel was formed? Or can we make some type of, as it were, can we see some continuous line that has been there?
Precisely, Turkish-Israeli relations can be characterized with ups and downs throughout the history of bilateral relations. And it has always been a topic of academic interest. These are two non-Arab, militarily strong, Western-oriented, perhaps less so for Turkey nowadays, but still. And they are surrounded by an unstable geopolitical landscape. And these two countries, possible cooperation is likely to alter balances in the region. So it has always been a topic of interest. My understanding of Turkish-Israeli relations, particularly Turkey's Israel policy, is a continuous struggle between realpolitik and identity, in which the former has often prevailed, at least until recent times, Scott. The Palestinian issue has always constituted a sensitive topic for Turkish society. It aroused sympathy both from the left and from the right of the political spectrum. Turkey's deep sympathy for the Palestinians' plight did not prevent her from recognizing Israel or engaging in cooperation with her. Turkey became the first Muslim majority country to recognize Israel in 1949. However, Turkish policymakers have also faced difficulty in striking a balance in their relations with Israel and the Muslim world. That is why Ankara has often preferred to keep relations, cooperation with Israel at a low profile in order not to antagonize the Arab countries. But from a closer look, you can see that in the history of bilateral relations, Turkey's approach to the Arab-Israeli conflict has shown parallels to her changing political alignments. So it wasn't always, a no to Israel. And it's also important to underline that Turkey's relations with Israel developed as a factor of her relations with the West, the United States in particular. In the wake of the Second World War, Turkey's aspiration to become a member of Western security structure catalyzed her recognition of Israel. And for a brief period during the Democratic Party rule, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, all concerned about the spread of Pan-Arabism and communism at that time, established a secret trilateral alliance in 1958. Also known as the Trident. And this triangular pact linked their national intelligence organizations, namely MIT, Mossad, and Savak. So the military cooperation between Turkey and Israel developed in such a degree that these two countries were about to launch a military campaign against Syria in 1959. Eventually, this offensive was never carried out, but still, just to give you an idea of the degree of cooperation between these two countries. However, after, let's say, 1965, bilateral relations entered a period of estrangement because of the Cyprus issue. Ankara sought diversification in foreign policy and therefore traded cooperation with Israel in order to win Arab support for Turkey's position on Cyprus in the international arena. And then came the oil crisis, and this pushed Turkey to embrace a more pro-Palestinian stance with regard to the Arab-Israeli conflict, hoping that they would be able to attract Arab capital and financial support. But even during these tough times, when relations hit low point, Turkey and Israel avoided direct confrontation, and Israel always respected Turkey's stance and preference to maintain bilateral relations at a low key, but kept on emphasizing common interests, sought to develop cooperation, explored opportunities when available in order to upgrade diplomatic relations. So in this context, maybe I'm thinking about decade by decade, trying to get there. But the 1980s constitutes a transition period in Turkish-Israeli relations. Again, it is important to underline that Turkey's relations with the United States underwent a change because that period, with international developments such as the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan marked the end of détente and drew the United States' attention back to the Middle East and Asia, which subsequently elevated Turkey's strategic importance. And in this period, Turkey's deference to Arab countries continued, but Turkish policymakers also started to reassess Israel's significance as an ally. The Arab countries, especially the Arab countries, they refrained from recognizing Cyprus, Turkish Republic of Cyprus, and this caused a serious frustration on Turkey's side. At the time, Turkey also had trouble with Islamist organizations' terrorist activities, particularly the Abu Nidal's organization. That Abu Nidal was a dissident faction of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, also known as the Black September back then. And Turkish officials were seriously concerned that the country was becoming a field for foreign militants. So Ankara started to review its relations with the Arab world and especially its unconditional support for the Palestinian cause. However, I can say that the turmoil in the Middle East delayed normalization in the 1980s between Turkey and Israel, particularly Israel's passing of the controversial Jerusalem Law in 1980, and then the attack on Iraq's nuclear plant Osirak. And then we have the annexation of Golan Heights, an invasion of Lebanon, and the outbreak of Intifada, of course, in 1986. So it was never the right time, perhaps. But moving to 1990s, This period stands out as an aberration in the history of bilateral relations, and it has often been referred to as the golden years, the so-called golden years. There have been a number of overlapping factors which rendered this period unique. To begin with, the Oslo peace process, which started with the Madrid Conference of 1991, created a favorable climate for Turkey to mend ties with Israel. Turkey's rapprochement with Israel, to say it in a better way. Secondly, Turkey and Israel had shared interests and threat perceptions back then. Turkey's relations with its neighbors, namely Syria, Iraq, and Iran, deteriorated sharply during this decade over PKK terrorism and the water issue. And in 1998, Turkey and Syria came to the brink of war. And this crisis culminated in the extradition of the PKK leader from Damascus. Turkey's strategic alignment with Israel back then functioned effectively in countering Syria and without triggering a regional war or a counter-alliance. So it worked really well. Another factor in facilitating rapprochement with Israel in the 1990s was the role of the Turkish armed forces, in my opinion, which promoted close defense ties with Israel. It was important because Israel became a significant ally for Turkey as a major arms supplier at a time when Turkey, fighting insurgency at home, faced difficulty in obtaining arms and other equipment from Germany and the United States because of human rights concerns, of course, which has similarities. I can see some similar trends today. There was also a domestic politics dimension of the Turkish militaries promoting ties with Israel. The army considered Turkey's relations with Israel as an antidote to the rise of political Islam, particularly from the mid-90s and onwards. So Turkey's cordial ties with Israel became a benchmark of the country's pro-Western and secular identity, I can say. That's why when the Welfare Party, an Islamist party known for its anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic stance, became a coalition partner in 1996, its leader, Necmettin Erbakan, dragged his feet, yet eventually bowed to the pressure and signed the defense agreements with Israel. Again, I'm thinking one has to highlight Turkey's ties with the United States when looking at Turkish-Israeli relations in that decade. During the Clinton administration, Turkey had problems, as I mentioned, with the US Congress blocking arms sales, imposing a covert embargo on Turkey. And in this respect, cooperation with Israel facilitated friendly ties with Washington, thanks to the influence of the Jewish lobbies. But Washington, too, came to see this flourishing cooperation to its benefit in terms of securing stability and order in the region. Therefore, the United States threw its weight behind this cooperation and acted as a shadow partner, facilitating this cooperation almost like a triangle. So moving to the AK Party period, coming to the 2000s, the bonds of trust were so strong in the 1990s that what came afterwards has been perceived as a cooling off period. But perhaps it was a period of stabilization. Indeed, the regional security structure, as well as the strategic incentives that made such a partnership between Turkey and Israel possible, had already changed even before the AK Party came to power. That's why I don't fully agree with the commentators who argue that the Turkish-Israeli relations were bound to fail during the AK Party period. To begin with, the outbreak of the Second Intifada effectively put an end to the Oslo peace process. And then we had the Adana Protocol of 1998, which paved the way for Turkey's normalization of relations with its neighbors, which subsequently decreased Israel's significance as a defense partner for Turkey. But still, the foundations of the bilateral ties built during the golden years were so strong that they remained intact at least until 2008, I can say.
That's such an excellent background. One thing that I guess asking as a student here, through these ups and downs, from 1948 for the next 60 years, is there a continuity, say, for the Turkish military and Turkish intelligence services? Do they always have that relationship with Israeli counterparts, even when there are political tensions at the top?
My hunch is yes. I think so. We can say that. But the two countries prefer to keep their relations at a low key, I would say. I mean, from the outside, You cannot say at which level the cooperation continues, but these two countries have overlapping interests, even though their threat perceptions or threat priorities may differ throughout history. But there is also another point I would like to make, and it is related to the role of the Turkish military, of course, because it is important. I think one of the factors which caused a change in Turkish-Israeli relations during the AK Party period is that throughout, parallel to the EU reform packages, the military was ultimately sidelined from politics, excluded from politics, which is, from a democratic perspective, a good thing, of course. But Turkish military constituted the backbone of Turkish-Israeli relations. So weakening of this pillar inevitably affected Turkish-Israeli relations.
So we're in the 21st century with first Prime Minister Erdogan, then President Erdogan, and AKP, the Justice and Development Party. You know, does Erdogan come in with this view of Israel as this sort of functional partner? Does he see it as a strategic partner? In other words, you know, this person who has been at the head of Turkish politics now for almost 20 years, when he first comes into the highest ranks of office, what is his vision of Israel?
I think not so much different than the Welfare Party leadership or the Welfare Party, I would say. But Erdogan was also a pragmatic leader. That's why, at least until the AK Party consolidated its power at home, relations with Israel and relations with the West kept on the same trajectory. I mean, they continued without disruption because they didn't want to attract, or they didn't want to alienate the Turkish military forces. They were fully aware that reorienting a foreign policy line would be met with opposition, would receive criticisms from other institutions. So pragmatically, they continued on the same foreign policy track. But when they felt strong enough, and this was, I think they owed a lot to the post 9/11 context, because 9/11 attacks elevated Turkey's profile in the international arena as a model country, as you know. And in this respect, the AK Party's Muslim identity, along with its claimed commitment to democratic values and secularism, received praise. And Turkey also benefited from the power vacuum in the post-Iraq war period. So parallel to its rising international image, Ankara felt encouraged, emboldened to pursue a more independent foreign policy line, more independent than the West. And at that point, parallel, also in addition to this, the AK Party's power consolidation at home eliminated possible rivals, especially the military. And this power consolidation provided the government a greater room to maneuver in foreign affairs. Therefore, Turkish policymakers were able to pursue policies that displayed more ideological perspectives and domestic political calculations. And that included not exactly severing relations, but perhaps keeping a distance, or I can say Turkey started to see Israel's cooperation not as significant as it used to be. So something that can be sacrificed or given up on Israel, I can say.
And did this sort of ideological or even identity politics manifest itself in terms of making Palestine the central issue? Or was it a question of Turkey leading the Muslim world? How was it presented?
Exactly, precisely. Especially with the Arab Spring, it provided a perfect opportunity for Ankara to fully implement that strategic depth doctrine. So Turkey set a very high goal for herself, aspiring to become a regional leader and even a global power. So Turkey tried to establish an alternative power axis in the Middle East as an alternative to Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi ideology and Iran's Shia crescent. So Turkey's Ottoman heritage and its religious identity were in a way instrumentalized to promote this goal. And the leading emphasis on leading the Ummah, embracing the Palestinian issue as if it was a domestic matter, ramping up the anti-Israeli rhetoric, were all manifestations of this new policy line, Scott, which continues up until today. And if we are going to see a reconciliation, that Turkey has to downplay this identity politics perspective a bit.
I guess that leads me, and we're not supposed to deal in counterfactuals, but let's try. I mean, if Turkey succeeds with its Syria policy, So not only that they push back against Bashar al-Assad, possibly push him out, but that the groups they work with are the ones that succeed rather than the Saudi-backed groups, the Qatari-backed groups. If Turkey gets more credit through the Arab world for that Syria policy, does that mean, in fact, they don't need Israel, that they actually have succeeded with that strategic depth after the Arab Spring?
I think that was their thinking. I mean, that was what they had in their mind, but it didn't work out the way they expected, Scott. And it is also interesting and quite ironic that Turkey and Israel supported the same groups without coordination, without coordinating with each other. That's also interesting. So at the end of the day, they have common interests when it comes to balancing Iran in Syria. So it is really interesting to study throughout what happened throughout the Syrian civil war and the positions of these two countries shifting in a parallel way, interestingly, even though they don't have any coordination or cooperation, or maybe there is, but we don't know yet. Maybe in the upcoming years, we will learn more about it.
There's another country involved in this maneuvering over Syria, which of course is Russia. And we know that since 2016, we talked to Professor Emre Erşin about this, that there's this agreement between Russia and Turkey to sort of not necessarily cooperate, but to work to deconfliction, they call it. So Turkey has its space, Russia has its space. Has that come into the Israel dynamic as well? In other words, are we talking about three countries, Turkey, Russia, and Israel, that are maneuvering amongst themselves, what we might call a modus vivendi?
But for a common interest?
Almost that you each have your sphere of influence in Syria. And that if you have your sphere of influence in Syria, you can agree to work on wider issues.
Yes, we can say so. We can say so. Interestingly, both Turkey and Israel have, I wouldn't say, of course, given the problems between Washington and Ankara, relations are not that strong and as strong as it used to be, at least. But still, they have good relations with the United States. At least Turkey is also trying to improve relations with the United States. And given the fact that it is still a NATO ally, so we can say that these are two Western-oriented countries still. So interestingly, they balance, they provide a counterweight to Russian influence in the Middle East as well, apart from the modus vivendi among them, of course, because Russia also, allows Turkey to continue to have her own area of influence. But on the other hand, we don't know what's going to happen once the negotiations, unfold between Washington and Ankara, because probably Kremlin would be twisting the screw more and more on Idlib, probably, and see how Turkey is going to, if Turkey continue to move towards the United States or not. So it will be a headache for Ankara, probably.
Which is what makes our job so interesting, trying to read the next steps.
Yeah, crisis is our job.
I guess, let me ask you, a general question out of that, and out of that, that rich historical analysis you gave me. It struck me that in the past, sometimes, Turkish-Israeli relations, there was an incentive to sort of work together in part because you were working with Washington. So, the Israelis, are getting American support. Turkey has an important strategic position. So Turkey and Israel cooperate together. It strikes me that now might be a bit different, that there's been Israeli skepticism about the Obama administration in recent years. They've got the incoming Biden administration where they may be a bit skeptical. Turkey, we know, has had its issues with the Obama administration, especially over a perceived lack of US support during the 2016 coup attempt. To what extent is this Turkey-Israeli relationship in recent years sort of a coming together, and possibly because both of them have problems with the United States, or that the United States is not necessarily at the center of their calculations as it might have been in the past?
Yes and no, I would say. Yes, there were times that Turkey, especially during the Obama administration, tried to present herself to Washington as a better ally compared to Israel in terms of securing order in the Middle East. that it had better connections. It was the country that had the power to talk to every country and various organizations, various non-state actors as well. But things have changed dramatically since then, as we know. Today, it is not the issue. I mean, Turkey is facing a regional isolation. So even though Biden administration would not be as pro-Israeli as the Trump administration, I don't think President Biden is going to take back the steps or the decisions, overall the decisions taken during the Trump administration, such as moving the embassy back to Tel Aviv or that kind of decision. So they will continue their Israel policy, but with perhaps providing more support to the Palestinians and trying to be more balanced in terms of, striking a balance between Israelis and the Palestinians, at least. That's my expectation. When it comes to the Middle East policy, I think I see a continuation of a trend, which is regionalism. And that is very much connected to what is happening at the international level, what is happening in the international system. The United States is no longer a global leader. I mean, is a waning global power, to say it in a correct way. So the U.S. retrenchment will continue. It started during the Obama administration. The Trump administration continued. It continued during the Trump administration, and now it is going to continue during the Biden administration as well. So the Middle East is still an important area, an important region, but as not important as it used to be. And in order for the United States to divert its attention to Pacific, pivot to Pacific, and channel its energy and resources to Pacific region to peacefully managing the rise of China, it has to spend its resources or use its resources in a smart way, the rest of its resources, let's say. So the United States needs allies, credible partners in the region to secure its interest in the region. The Middle East is important, of course, still continues to be an important region in terms of, the energy resources. Okay, it's true, the United States is a self-sufficient, in terms of energy resources, is a self-sufficient country now, doesn't need the energy resources of the Middle East, but still, for other allies and partners to get access to these resources, and also for the flow of trade to continue without disruption, it is important that security and order is preserved in that region. And also, Middle East constitutes an important leg of China's One Belt, One Road policy. So it is also important in terms of balancing and perhaps encircling China in that region. So when I think about this, I think Turkey can play an important role in terms of balancing against Russia, against Iran, and against China, perhaps. If Turkey can mend its ties with the countries in the region, not only with Israel, but also Saudi Arabia and Egypt, of course. And this can pave the way for normalization of relations with other allies in the region and perhaps dial down tensions, thereby contribute to the peace and security in the region.
So, Selin, we've got this normalization of relations where you have, Turkey and Israel within this context of the Arab world, but what changed specifically now? What changed to lead to maybe President Erdogan's speech last month to open up this further possibility with Turkey and Israel?
Well, I would say the cost of Turkey's identity-based foreign policy started to outweigh its benefits, Scott. For one thing, Turkey's support for the Muslim Brotherhood proved costly, undermining its relations with Egypt and the Gulf countries and resulting in regional isolation. Turkey has repeatedly underlined that the Palestinian issue is its red line. However, this red line policy yielded to little to no practical outcome. And in the post-Arab Spring period, particularly the rise of Iran's regional power and influence in the region has eclipsed the Palestinian issue. On the other hand, Turkish policymakers' concentration on Syria, almost in an obsessive manner, caused Ankara to overlook developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. this informal energy cooperation initiated in the wake of the Mavi Marmara between Greece, Israel, and then Cyprus, Greek Cyprus, evolved into a strategic alliance that ultimately excluded Turkey. Equally important is the fact that Turkey today is seeking more balanced relations with the West. So again, we see a similar trend coming back. Turkey's military campaign in Idlib back in February 2020 showed the limits of Turkey's cooperation with Russia in a way, because the country's skies were under Russian air defense protection. On the other hand, the pandemic caught Turkey in the middle of an economic crisis and unfortunately aggravated economic challenges. So given Ankara's huge debt, external debt, and the ongoing currency crisis, recalibrating relations with the West would be helpful in terms of attracting foreign investment. So in this backdrop, of course, recent developments have surely accelerated Ankara's search for a diplomatic opening. I'm referring to the prospect of sanctions from the United States and the EU. So my understanding of the statements from the high-level Turkish officials about establishing cordial relations with Israel, as well as the United States and the European Union, suggests to me that Ankara is seeking a possible reset in foreign policy.
And does this mean also a reach out from Ankara towards Egypt and towards Saudi Arabia?
Negotiations are, I think, being pursued. Ankara also extended an olive branch to Saudi Arabia and Egypt at the same time. At least at the intelligence level, there have been negotiations going on, as far as we read from the press. So these are simultaneously going on.
So we've got almost, in a sense, the return of this strategic depth that we kept hearing about a decade ago.
We've gone too deep. We have gone too deep, so we're trying to, climb back and get to the surface once again.
So depth actually meant sinking, and now you're trying to come back up to the top. I guess then to sort of wrap this up for now, then is how much of this opening does rest upon leader to leader in the sense of, we have President Erdogan on the one side, but we've got the fourth set of Israeli elections in 2 years on the other, and we're not sure it'll be a Benjamin Netanyahu on the other side. If either Erdogan or Netanyahu disappear, does this actually affect this, or is this now sort of an institution to institution relationship that is developing?
Well, it may affect, of course, but since both Netanyahu and Erdogan are likely to stay, so I think the two countries have to find a way to live together in a friendly way. They should find a way to reconcile with each other. And of course, the fact that Israelis are going to the polls again this year, Israel's domestic political context is not very much conducive to, of course, Ankara's normalization efforts. But still, perhaps after the elections, we can see some steps coming from Israel as well. But I would like to say something about what Turkey is hoping to get from normalization with Israel. And it is not only, decreasing her regional isolation, but also there is this Biden effect. People talk about this, and I agree. With President Biden taking office, President Erdogan will no longer enjoy the privileges of leader-to-leader relations established during the Trump administration. And Turkish-American relations are expected to enter a tough period, at least in the short run, considering the Biden administration's sensitivity toward the issues of democracy and human rights. So given the anti-Turkish opposition in the US Congress, Turkey might be hoping that Israel can neutralize the opposition and perhaps help Turkey win Washington's ear again. But all depends on, of course, restoration of mutual trust between the two countries. Before that, I don't expect Israel to lobby on behalf of Turkey if they cannot, solve their issues in the first place.
And I guess something does come to mind because you keep turning the kaleidoscope and things that could unsettle this. We haven't yet mentioned the Kurdish issue, which has a particular resonance in both Turkish domestic and regional politics. Is there any chance that the Kurdish issue could take a turn which could jeopardize a Turkish-Israeli rapprochement? Or is Israel distanced enough from the Kurdish issue that it shouldn't have any effect?
Well, if Turkey and Israel can mend their ties, this will, I think, help Turkey's cause, or how can I say, Turkey is presenting the Kurdish dossier to Washington. It's interesting that unlike Turkey, Israel has never considered Kurds as an existential threat. Historically, Israel has always had cordial relations with the Kurds dating back to Mollah Barzani years. Even when Turkey and Israel began to develop a strategic alliance in the 1990s, Israel preferred to address it from a broader perspective, broader framework of cooperation against terrorism, instead of taking an active role in Turkey's struggle against PKK, in order not to alienate the Kurds in the region. Of course, no one can deny the fact that Mossad and CIA assisted Turkey in capturing the PKK leader Öcalan. It was a door-to-door delivery to Turkish intelligence in 1999. But I would like to come back to Israel's support for the referendum of 2017, because it was important in terms of undermining trust in the so-called normalization process, which didn't work out well after 2016. I had the chance to talk to Israeli officials on this issue for my research. Cue shameless self-promotion here. I can say that Israel's decision was motivated by both domestic and foreign concerns. An overlooked detail here is that there are about 300,000 Kurdish Jews living in Israel. A majority of these people are wealthy families who support the Likud party. Also, Israel's response was a tit for tat for Erdogan's support for Hamas. So they were pressing on each other's toes, we can say. So in the case that we see a reconciliation between Turkey and Israel, perhaps Israel would go back to its traditional ambivalent stance, perhaps, with regard to the Kurds, instead of coming out and providing full support, or at least presenting to give support for their sovereignty demands in the region. That's my hunch.
Your hunches have been so great throughout this. For now, I have to pause, but let's, can I get a promise for you that maybe in a few months' time, after the Israeli election and after other developments, that you'll come back and see whether this diplomatic dance is working out between Israel and Turkey, or whether they are stepping on each other's toes again.
With great pleasure. I would like to come back and discuss these issues, of course.
That's fantastic. Selin Nasi, thank you so much for introducing us to this Turkish-Israeli issue. And let me thank you, viewers, for joining us on World Unfiltered on this learning process. We will be back soon in another week or two with yet a follow-up program, not just about Turkey and Israel, but about other areas of the world. Until then, please follow Deep Dive Politics on Facebook, on Twitter. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to one another. I'm Scott Lucas, and this is World Unfiltered.